Okay, so welcome to the second lesson on the respiratory system. Just to remind ourselves, so it's roughly page 143 in our notes book, and just to remind ourselves of the pathway that oxygen has to take to get into our lungs. So it goes through the nose, from there down the trachea, into the bronchus, the bronchioles, and finally into the alveoli, where it's going to get into your bloodstream. Now, this is the movement of gas particles, so you should have an answer for what's the process by which gas exchange happens, and that is diffusion. So diffusion is a process in a question. In terms of just the nose, what is it that the nose actually does for air? So if I have any asthmatics in the room, you will know that the nose warms the air, so that reduces your chance of having an asthma attack. We're going to talk a little bit more about it today. It also moistens the air for us, and it filters the air, so it takes out some bad things. So we're going to talk about those. And in terms of our trachea, the trachea has rings of cartilage, and they stop the trachea from collapsing, because if that was to happen, no gas exchange could take place. So we don't want that to happen. So the rings of cartilage prevent the tube from collapsing, but the reason for the collapsing is to maintain gas exchange all the time. Now, if you want to add this into your page 143, you can. These answer certain questions that the SEC asks. So I'm going to play you this now.
The respiratory system moves air through the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchus to the alveoli, where the gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs. Nares are the openings to the nose. The nasal cavity is lined with cilia, mucous membranes, and blood capillaries. The air is filtered by cilia, moistened by mucous membranes, and warmed by the blood. Air moves into the pharynx or throat, the common passageway for food and air. Air continues on to the larynx. The epiglottis, a flap of tissue in front of the larynx, closes off the larynx when swallowing to prevent food from entering. The larynx or voice box contains the vocal folds. The trachea or windpipe connects the larynx to the bronchial tree. The cartilage rings of the trachea prevent the trachea from collapsing. Lungs are spongy tissue with alveoli and blood capillaries. Breathing occurs because of the expansion and contraction of the lungs. The bronchi carrying the air subdivide into smaller branches called bronchioles. At the end of each bronchiole are the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs are surrounded by blood capillaries and contain millions of single-layer alveoli cells where the gas exchange takes place. Oxygenated air goes from the nose to the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, and alveoli. By the process of diffusion, oxygen in the air moves from the alveoli to the capillaries. Carbon dioxide moves from the capillaries to the alveoli and is exhaled. This process is called respiration.
Now, the only thing I have an issue with one of the main things I have an issue with in that animation is the fact that breathing is not respiration as such. The SEC consider respiration to be the breakdown of food in the form of glucose to get energy in the form of ATP, and we'll do that in Form 5. So please, if nothing else, breathing is not respiration. Now, in terms of today, we're going to talk about what adaptations make alveoli great, and adaptations are just features, some feature that gives an organism an advantage, or in this case, what make alveoli really, really good at their jobs. So we just need to change this again for you.
Exchange. All of our cells need energy. They get it by breaking down glucose, a simple sugar we get from food. This process, called cellular respiration, uses oxygen and produces carbon dioxide as waste. The main function of the respiratory system is to provide the oxygen from out of the air and remove the carbon dioxide into the air. This takes place in the lungs, with the gases carried to and from the cells by the bloodstream. The exchange of gases between the blood and the air occurs in the alveoli, microscopic air sacs in the lungs that are surrounded by tiny blood vessels. When we inhale, all 300 million alveoli expand and fill with air. Oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli. Diffusion is the natural movement of gas or liquid particles from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Think of how the smell of baking biscuits spreads out from the oven right through the house. Diffusion can even take place through a membrane if the particles are small enough to get through it. For example, a helium balloon that's been left for a couple of days gets smaller and softer because the helium has slowly diffused through the skin of the balloon into the surrounding air. The walls of the alveoli are membranes too, ones that oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse through. Because breathing keeps bringing fresh air into the lungs and the circulatory system keeps bringing blood that is low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide, diffusion always acts to bring oxygen into the body and take carbon dioxide out. And this goes on day in, day out, for every minute of our lives, so that our cells stay alive and so that we stay alive.
Okay, so you don't have this diagram, but you do have a version of a diagram. And I will bring that diagram up in a second, but it's just the idea that always, always, always the movement is going to be oxygen is going to go into your red blood cells and carbon dioxide is going to be in your plasma, and that is going to go into your lungs. And this is where you start taking your notes now. So gas exchange in your lungs and in the tissues occurs via diffusion. And you now should know what diffusion is, so you have a space to remind yourself. So there's 3 parts to it. It is going to come up last, obviously. So it is the spreading out of molecules from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration, and that is along the concentration gradients. And we have said that diffusion is an example of passive transport, and the reason it's passive, so this is going back to your end of topic, is because there is no energy needed. That's what makes it passive transport. So that's just going back now to our end of topic. So from our little diagram here, the oxygen concentration is higher in your lungs, so oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into your blood, specifically your red blood cells. That's what carries our oxygen. And at the exact same time, carbon dioxide concentration is higher in our blood, so it diffuses from the blood plasma into the alveolus. So if you have a look at the little diagram here, it's not in color in your book, but you will see that here the blood is pinker or redder, so usually that's associated with blood containing oxygen. And down here the blood is bluer, and that is usually because carbon dioxide, there's more carbon dioxide present in your plasma, but more importantly there isn't oxygen in your red blood cells, so your red blood cells kind of go a purpley colour when there's no oxygen in them or very low oxygen concentrations in them. Okay, now what makes the alveoli really, really good for their job? So again, you have one of the versions of pictures that's coming out, but it's just showing you oxygen diffuses out, carbon dioxide diffuses in, and this is gas exchange. So again, that's our earlier diagram. Now, the first thing is that the lining of the alveolus, so that's this part here, this is just 1 cell thick. And our capillary up here is also 1 cell thick, and that makes it really, really easy for diffusion to happen. So that's our first adaptation. The second adaptation is you see on this picture here, and that is the fact that there is a really, really good blood supply. So each alveoli is covered in a net of thin-walled blood capillaries. It's a really good blood supply. It's 1 cell thick, and that again allows for diffusion to happen really, really quickly. The last two then are the fact that, so the easiest way to explain alveoli is, if you've ever seen the little nets you can buy onions in or mandarin oranges, and if you could imagine the alveoli as being grapes and then covered with that net. So the grapes are the alveoli, and the skin on the grape is the one cell thick part, and the net itself is now the capillary network that goes over the kind of grape-like things. And because there's so many of them, they have a really large surface area. So there's buckets and buckets of alveoli in your lungs. That's a really big surface area, and that allows for diffusion all of the time. And the other thing that is how the alveoli are adapted for their function is they are moist and elastic. So they'll get bigger when you inhale, and then they'll go reduce in size as you exhale, get bigger as you inhale. So that's what the elastic part means, that they get bigger in size. In terms of now just the last little bit of this today, because this is quite a short lesson, we have mucus, we have cilia, and WBC stands for white blood cells. So they all have very specific jobs. So mucus you will be aware of, and white blood cells you should be aware of, but cilia will be a new thing. So the mucus that's in your nose is really good at trapping dust and germs and things that you don't want putting into your lungs. And usually when we're really kind of sick, we'll obviously blow it out our nose, but sometimes we'll go and then we end up swallowing it, and that's great because it's now just gone into a bag of acid in your stomach, so whatever's there is definitely dead. But the most important part is it doesn't go down to your lungs. These are the cilia. So what cilia are, they're tiny, tiny hairs, and they actually beat upwards. So they're in your trachea and they beat upwards and they move mucus towards your esophagus. So if we draw our little diagram from the last day, if that was our esophagus, and we have our epiglottis and we have our tube down, these little hairs are along here, and they literally beat upwards, so that if you have anything that's gone down towards your lungs, it gets trapped here and it gets put up, and usually when it's this part here, you will go to get the last of it up and you will swallow at this point. And then we have also white blood cells that live in our alveoli, and they are really good at engulfing bacteria, so that totally destroys them, and any other bits of foreign matter that might be there as well. They will do their best to get rid of them if it's biological. If it's a piece of plastic or something like that, then that is not going to happen. And I think that pretty much leaves it at the end of our lesson. So if we were in class now, we would be doing a quick quiz. I have put that quick quiz onto forms for you. So they're all one-word answers, everything in it that we've talked about today except for the last question. And there will be, the rag notes, you'll put them into their class notes section because you are great. And there are a few homework questions that come from, if memory serves, the exam questions that are after the rag sheet. So let me just see. So roughly in my book it is page 158. So I'll have those in the class notebook page for you. So I am on Zoom right now waiting for you if you have any questions, and I would love to see you.